They told me I didn't belong. But what happened next changed everything. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when Karen, a successful black woman who had spent years working tirelessly to build a life she was proud of, found herself at the airport, ready to board her flight. She'd been traveling for work more than ever lately, and this particular trip was important. It wasn't just about the work itself. No, it was about the opportunity. The chance to meet with potential clients, to prove that she had earned everything she'd worked for. With a calm sense of confidence, she approached the check-in counter, where the attendant greeted her with a smile, asking for her boarding pass. VIP seat, huh? The attendant commented, scanning her ticket. I guess you're lucky. Karen smiled back, her hard work leading her to the kind of privileges she had dreamed of for so long. But little did she know, this would be the day she would experience something she never thought she would face. Not in this setting, not in 2025. As she made her way to the VIP lounge, she could feel the looks. Subtle at first. A glance here, a stare there. She shrugged them off, too accustomed to the idea that some people didn't like to see someone like her in places they believed were only meant for people who looked a certain way. Karen had learned long ago to hold her head high. It was her space. She had earned it. She sat down in the plush VIP chair, her thoughts drifting as she read through her emails. Then, a voice interrupted her moment of calm. Two airline staff members, a man and a woman, approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman said, her tone less than friendly. "You're sitting in the VIP section, but you don't belong here." Karen blinked, confusion crossing her face. She straightened up. "I beg your pardon?" she asked. The man stepped forward, his voice cold. "This area is for paying customers. You're not on the list." Karen could feel the blood rushing to her face. She showed them her ticket once again. "I have a first-class seat. That's why I'm in the VIP section." The woman shook her head dismissively. "This seat is reserved for someone else," she said. "I'm afraid you'll have to give it up." In that moment, Karen could feel her heart race. What was going on? She had been a loyal customer for years. She had worked hard to reach this point in her life. Why were they treating her like this? "Let me speak to your manager," Karen insisted, her voice calm but firm. She was not about to let this slide. Not today. But as the airline staff members exchanged a look, Karen could sense something wasn't right. The woman nodded to the man, who returned with a vague promise. "We'll sort this out," he said, but the way he said it made Karen feel like something far more sinister was at play. It wasn't long before the manager arrived. She wasn't much help. In fact, her attitude was worse than the staff members who'd confronted Karen. The manager glanced at Karen, looked down at her ticket, and without even saying a word, directed Karen to move to another part of the lounge. She told Karen she was being difficult, and implied that maybe Karen was misunderstanding the situation. But Karen knew what this was. She had been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment before. It wasn't about the seat. It wasn't about the ticket. It was about something deeper. She was being told that she didn't belong. She was furious. But rather than lose her cool, she made a choice. She would stand up for herself no matter the cost. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let this be the moment that broke her. "I'm not moving," Karen said firmly, her voice unwavering. The manager, visibly irritated, turned away. "Fine. You can stay, but we'll have to report this to the higher-ups. We won't tolerate disruptions." Karen didn't flinch. "If you want to report me, go ahead. But I'm not leaving." Just as the manager walked off, one of the passengers in the VIP lounge, a white woman, came over. She had been sitting quietly, watching everything unfold. She had seen the entire interaction, and when Karen spoke up, the woman smiled. "I saw everything," the woman said softly, her voice low. "You should have a right to sit wherever you want. They don't get to treat you like this." Karen was taken aback, her emotions swirling. She had been so used to fighting this battle alone, but here was someone willing to speak up, to take a stand with her. The woman continued. "I'll back you up. Let's go talk to someone higher up together." Karen hesitated for a moment. It had never been this simple before. People had always turned a blind eye. But today it felt different. The two women walked up to the front desk together. When they spoke to the higher-up, Karen explained everything, how she was treated unfairly, how they tried to make her feel small. The higher-up looked at Karen with wide eyes, then turned to the staff members who had been involved. And in a moment that seemed surreal, the higher-up didn't back the staff members. "I'm so sorry," the higher-up said, clearly flustered. "I'll take care of this immediately." Karen could feel the eyes of others in the lounge watching the interaction. The staff members were forced to apologize, but the damage had been done. Karen had faced something ugly that she would never forget. And as she walked away from that counter, the shock of the moment started to hit her. But then, just as she was preparing for her flight, an unexpected turn of events unfolded. A message arrived on her phone, and it was from the airline. It said that an internal investigation had been launched into the staff members' behavior. At first, Karen wasn't sure what it meant, but then another notification came through. The staff members had been suspended. As the days passed, the story spread. The shocking treatment that Karen had faced became viral news. People from all walks of life rallied behind her, sharing their own stories of discrimination and injustice. And the airline, in an unexpected move, took swift action. The 2 employees who had mistreated Karen were not just reprimanded. They were fired. It was an unexpected consequence, but it was one that sent shockwaves through the entire company. The world was watching, and Karen had unknowingly become a symbol of resistance and strength. In the days that followed, Karen's phone kept buzzing with messages of support. Strangers from across the country were reaching out, telling her how much they admired her courage. They told her how her actions had sparked something inside them, and how they too had faced situations where they felt like they didn't belong, but Karen had shown them that standing up for yourself was always worth it. And as for Karen, she knew that the road to true equality and respect wasn't over. She knew there would be more battles to fight, more struggles to endure. But she had proven to herself that she would never back down. She would never be silenced. She had reclaimed her power, and in doing so, had given others the strength to reclaim theirs. Karen couldn't believe what had just happened. The moment the staff members were fired, it felt surreal. It wasn't just the immediate relief of knowing that justice had been served in that instant, but the weight of everything that had led up to that point. Every glance she'd received, every doubt placed in her mind, every single time she had to fight to be seen in spaces where others thought she didn't belong, it all hit her at once. She had always known that she would face these kinds of moments. But this was different. It wasn't just about a seat on a flight. It was about the seat she had earned, the seat she deserved. She had spent years of her life fighting for opportunities, climbing up the ladder, and constantly proving herself in a world that often tried to tell her she was not enough. And now, in the span of a few moments, someone had tried to take that away from her. But it wasn't the staff members' actions that lingered with Karen. It was the countless people who had stood up for her. The woman who had stepped in to offer support when no one else did, the higher-up who had listened and acted swiftly, and even the strangers who had reached out to offer their words of encouragement. Karen felt a deep sense of gratitude for these people who had proven that kindness, courage, and unity could still thrive even in the face of ignorance. Her emotions were complicated. There was anger, yes. Anger at the way she had been treated, at the unfairness that so many others like her had experienced. But there was also a sense of empowerment, a feeling that she had done more than just stand up for herself. She had stood up for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every person who had ever been made to feel small simply because of who they were. And as much as she wanted to forget the incident and move on with her life, she couldn't. The world was watching. The story was everywhere. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, Karen was invited to speak on various platforms about what had happened and the larger issue of racial discrimination that still plagued the airline industry and society at large. At first, Karen was hesitant. She wasn't sure if she was ready to become a public figure, to open herself up to the kind of scrutiny and judgment that often followed people in her position. But as she read through the hundreds of messages from people who had felt inspired by her actions, she realized that her voice could make a difference. Her story was not just hers to tell, it was the story of countless others who had been silenced or overlooked for too long. She began to speak out. She shared her story with anyone who would listen, and as she did, she became more and more convinced that this moment, this painful but powerful chapter of her life, could be a turning point, not just for her but for society as a whole. The airline, of course, was forced to issue a public apology. They acknowledged the behavior of their staff and promised to implement anti-racism training across their entire workforce. But Karen wasn't satisfied with just an apology. She knew that apologies without action meant nothing. She pressed on, demanding accountability, not only from the airline but from every institution that perpetuated these kinds of systemic issues. And then, something remarkable happened. A few days after the incident, Karen received a phone call. It was from a nonprofit organization dedicated to racial justice and equality. They wanted her to become a spokesperson for their campaign, to use her newfound platform to raise awareness and push for real change. At first, Karen wasn't sure if she was the right person for the job. She wasn't a public speaker. She wasn't a politician or a well-known activist. But then she thought about it. She thought about all the people who had reached out to her after the incident, thanking her for showing them that it was okay to stand up, to demand respect. She thought about the woman in the VIP lounge who had taken a stand with her, about the higher-up who had done the right thing. And so, Karen accepted. Her first speech as a spokesperson was a pivotal moment in her life. Standing in front of a crowded room, her heart raced. But as she began to speak, something inside her shifted. Her voice grew stronger, her words more confident. She spoke not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been treated unjustly, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Her speech went viral. It was shared across social media, covered by news outlets, and even talked about in classrooms. Karen found herself at the center of a movement that was larger than anything she had ever imagined. And with each passing day, she felt the weight of her responsibility grow heavier. But even with all the attention, Karen never lost sight of what truly mattered. She had never set out to be a public figure. She wasn't doing this for fame or accolades. She was doing this because she believed in something greater, the idea that we all deserve respect, dignity, and equality regardless of the color of our skin. She kept her feet on the ground. She continued to meet with everyday people who shared their stories of discrimination, who had faced their own battles and struggles. She listened and she learned. And with every conversation, her resolve grew stronger. She knew that this fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The airline, in the wake of the scandal, made significant changes. They partnered with organizations like the one Karen had aligned herself with, dedicating resources to initiatives that would address racial disparities and promote diversity and inclusion. But Karen knew that true change didn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and dedication, not just from corporations but from every individual. And so she kept pushing. She continued to speak out, to demand more from those in power, to challenge the status quo. She became a voice for the voiceless, using her platform to amplify the stories of others who had been silenced for far too long. It wasn't just about fighting for justice anymore. It was about creating a future where no one would ever have to fight like this again. Where people, regardless of their race, gender, or background, would be able to walk through this world with their heads held high, knowing that they were valued, respected, and worthy of every opportunity. Karen's story, which had begun with a simple moment of injustice, had blossomed into a movement. She had faced something horrible, but from that pain she had found her purpose. The woman who had once been forced to fight for a seat on a plane was now leading a global conversation about equality, dignity, and respect. She had gone from being just one person with a story to being a symbol of change. And while the journey was far from over, Karen was ready. She was ready to continue the fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told that they didn't belong. As she stood in front of the crowd at her next speech, Karen took a deep breath and smiled. She was no longer just the woman who had been asked to give up her seat. She was the woman who had taken her seat back, and in doing so had helped others take theirs too. As the months passed, Karen's journey continued, with twists and turns that kept her on her toes. What had begun as an isolated incident of racial discrimination in an airport lounge had transformed into a larger mission, one that was shaping the very fabric of society. The media storm had subsided somewhat, but the work Karen was doing in the background had only gained momentum. She wasn't just leading conversations, she was spearheading them. She had become the face of a movement that resonated deeply with people from all walks of life, particularly those who had suffered silently for far too long. But with this newfound fame came enormous pressure. The weight of responsibility often kept her up at night. She had become the symbol of a fight she had never asked to lead, and at times, it felt like too much to bear. Every day, new stories from people who had experienced racism in various forms filled her inbox. She knew their pain. She had lived it, fought through it. But now they were all looking to her for answers, for hope. Could she really make a difference in a world that often seems so entrenched in hatred and division? On the surface, Karen was an advocate for change. She spoke at rallies, appeared on talk shows, and even advised corporations on how to implement anti-racism policies. Her face graced magazine covers, and her words were quoted in articles about racial justice and equality. But underneath it all, she struggled with her identity. Who was she now? The woman who had been publicly humiliated on a flight? Or the woman who was now leading the charge for systemic change? The line between the two had blurred, and at times, Karen felt like she was losing herself in the very fight she was so passionate about. One evening, after a long day of meetings and speeches, Karen sat alone in her apartment, exhausted. Her phone buzzed, another message from a stranger telling her how much her courage had meant to them. As much as she appreciated the support, she longed for a sense of normalcy. The fight for racial justice had consumed her every waking moment. She missed the simplicity of her old life, the one where her biggest concern was getting to her next destination without encountering a discriminatory incident. But that life was gone now. It had been replaced with a new reality, one that was constantly demanding her time, energy, and emotions. Karen's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She rose and opened it to find a delivery person holding a small box. It was unmarked, no return address, just a plain package. Intrigued, Karen took the box and brought it inside. She opened it carefully, revealing a small, handcrafted wooden plaque. Read, "Your voice matters." Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the letters with her fingers. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a political statement or an award. It was a simple reminder that what she was doing mattered. In that moment, Karen realized that it wasn't about the media coverage, the public speeches, or the accolades. It was about the impact she was having on people's lives. She had sparked something. She had given people the courage to speak up, to demand better. And that was the real victory. It had taken months of hard work, but Karen had finally reached a place of clarity. She was no longer just the woman who had been discriminated against on that flight. She was the woman who had turned her pain into power, her experience into a catalyst for change. And that change wasn't just happening on a large scale, it was happening in the hearts and minds of individuals. Every person who had been touched by her story was now part of the movement. They were carrying the torch forward, spreading the message of equality, dignity, and respect in their own communities. Karen's work wasn't finished. There were still countless battles to fight. Racism was still deeply embedded in society, and there would always be people who sought to undermine progress. But Karen was no longer afraid of the fight. She had seen firsthand how far a single voice could go. Her story was a testament to the power of standing up for what's right no matter the odds. In the years that followed, Karen continued to fight for justice. She built a foundation dedicated to providing resources for marginalized communities, creating safe spaces for individuals to share their stories and access support. She worked with corporations to implement more inclusive policies, ensuring that people of all backgrounds felt valued and respected in the workplace. And she became a mentor to the next generation of activists, offering guidance and encouragement to those who would carry the torch after her. But perhaps the most significant change came within Karen herself. Over time, she found peace with the woman she had become. She learned to balance the demands of her work with the need for self-care. She reconnected with the people she loved, making time for her family and friends who had always supported her. She began to laugh again, to enjoy the small moments that life had to offer, and to remember that her worth was not defined by the battles she fought, but by the person she was at her core. One evening, as Karen sat on her porch watching the sunset, she received a call from her old friend, the woman who had supported her during the flight incident. They had lost touch over the years as both had become consumed with their own lives and causes. But now as they spoke, Karen could hear the warmth and love in her voice, a reminder of the bond they had formed that day in the lounge. "I've been thinking about you," her friend said, "and everything you've done. I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of you." Karen smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you. But it's not just me. It's all of us together." And that was the truth. While Karen had been the face of the movement, she knew that it wasn't about any one person. It was about the collective effort of everyone who had fought alongside her. The activists, the allies, the everyday people who had taken a stand, they were all part of this journey. They had proven that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for, and that no one was ever alone in the fight for equality. As Karen ended the call, she looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath. She was at peace. She had fought the good fight and she had made a difference. The road ahead was still long, but she had no doubt that the world was slowly but surely moving toward a better future. And as she stood there, her hand resting on her heart, Karen made a silent promise to herself and to those who would come after her, that she would continue to be a voice for those who had been silenced, a light in the darkness for those who had been overlooked, and a reminder to the world that no matter who we are, we all deserve a seat at the table. Her journey wasn't just her own. It was the journey of every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, of every person who had been made to feel small. It was a journey of strength, resilience, and hope. And as she looked toward the future, Karen knew that the fight for justice would never end. But with every step she took, she was making the world a little bit better, one voice, one action at a time.